Hi, this is John Kinch. I'm the director of Michigan Energy Options. Welcome to the third webinar we've had this winter around solar and clean energy issues. I'm delighted today to be able to introduce and speak with Gretchen Bakke. She literally wrote the book called The Grid about the American transmission and distribution grid and how it's going to fare as we bring on a whole bunch of new renewable energy with wind and solar. This summer, we're going to reconstitute a series of conversations again that around solar and those kinds of topics. We'd like to ask your opinion for those of you who've been with us a bit, if there's particular topics you're interested in hearing about. I've got a couple in mind myself, but please send us a note, an email if you have something in particular you're interested in learning about. So Gretchen Bakke is a PhD, and what I find so fascinating about her particular background, and especially writing a book about the transmission and distribution grid, which is highly technical in many ways, is that she's not an energy engineer or some kind of background like that. She's a cultural anthropologist, and I actually think that's really an important quality that she brings to this particular work, because she's looking at us, our species, if you will, and how we interact with our environment, which is what cultural anthropologists often do. I've sometimes made the joke that our species has gone from Homo sapiens to something like Homo electris, that we really we are defined by electricity and energy. We need this. It's who we are. And so her book on the grid is just a really wonderful study of that behavior of our own, how it's come into being, and how reliant we are on it today. We had a conversation a little earlier and some technical difficulties, so we're going to join the conversation with Gretchen now in a second, in which she's responding to a question I put to her about how does a cultural anthropologist tackle an issue like the grid.
The story of the grid is in some ways the story of America, and in America at that particular moment in time, much smaller groups of people were beginning to intervene in the system. So it seemed like the right time to sort of talk about why it wasn't easy to integrate renewables at scale, and also just sort of give people the information they needed about how the infrastructure was structured as an idea as much as a physical system. So that's a long way of saying I had to learn really a lot.
Well, yeah, this book is you know, your endnotes alone. Clearly, this is a well-researched piece of scholarship.
But even just talking to electrical engineers, it's you know, you ask an electrical engineer a question, and in my case, I would ask the question, and then I would go home and I would read, and I'd talk to 3 or 4 other people, and then I would ask another electrical engineer the same question until I got to the point where it's like, okay, I understand the answer to this, and then I would try to write it in such a way that it would be really easy and exciting. The story of the transformation of the formation and then transformation of the US electric grid is an exciting story. So I wanted that kind of drama also to come into the book to make something fun to read, because normally the grid is not, people don't look out their window and see a wire and say, ooh, that seems really exciting to me. Right, you might.
I might, but yeah, I've got other issues. So yeah, I oftentimes think the story of the grid, or even the story of our own energy system, is kind of going from decentralized to centralized, and now we're heading back to something which is kind of decentralized. Could you just give us a quick overview of what the grid is that most of us have been used to, say, since, you know, post World War II till, you know, even up until the 2000s, how it functioned?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's so many stories to this infrastructure. Yeah. I think that the thing that's important, there are a couple of things that are really important to realize about the grid. One is that it's not designed for us, it's designed for our machines. So it is there, we can't interact with electricity, right? It's lethal. And so it's this thing which is there to run all of our machines, and it allows us to continue to be very creative with the kinds of machines we construct and plug into it, but without us ever having any contact with it. And that's the whole point, is you actually want to stay away from electricity. And yet, nevertheless, it's this incredibly intimate power source, especially now in our everyday lives. We have now, computers in our pockets all of the time, and those are, to my mind, a part of the grid, right? That is the battery charge in your phone was created, let's say, in a coal burning power plant that's situated outside of the place where you live, and transmitted through these long distance transmission lines into the sort of lower voltage distribution system, into your house, through your meter, into your phone, into your pocket. And then normally things which are plugged in, it goes all the way back around again. And I feel like there's this tendency to forget about the intimate pieces of it, that these machines are not, we actually feel something for our toasters and our laptop computers and our telephones and our refrigerators. All of those things matter to us and who we are. And so there's this kind of intimacy with this technology or the system that we nevertheless never come into contact with and don't really understand. So to answer your question, the system that we have right now was, in fact, because coal especially is so polluting, as soon as it was possible to transmit electricity over a long distance, all those coal burning power plants moved outside of cities, so outside of the areas where we actually use power. So in urban areas, that's where you can make money off of electricity. That's not to say that rural people aren't using it, but it's hard to make a profit off of rural people, and that actually matters a lot to the structure of the grid, and the structure also of the laws which govern it, which force essentially utilities to provide electricity also to non-profitable communities, which are poor people and rural people. So that's also a very important piece of it. But this idea that you get the pollution, you create electricity in a giant amount of it, and you do it as far away from a population center that uses that power as possible. And that is the power system that we kind of grew up with in the that really came into place in the 1920s, but it has just absolutely held sway until the late 1970s. And even then, the cracks in the system were legislatively in place, but it wasn't really until the 90s that you start to get small amounts, especially of renewable power, being brought into the grid. And part of that is that it was just, it was essentially not legal to do it before the late 1970s. And if you want to know like how exciting the Carter administration was, you should definitely read the book. Not a total shout out, but I was like, I can't believe I have to write an entire chapter on the 1970s. And then when I got into it, it's really a really exciting time in the sort of bringing to life again of the utility industry, of electrical generation, of sort of ideas that people were having about the environment at that moment in time being actually built out into infrastructure. There's just so much that happened that we didn't see the results of for 10, 15, 20 years, but the roots of it were in those, especially legislative moments at state and at federal level.
Right. One of the things about the national transmission and distribution grid, of course, is that we have regional transmission operators. We have, in our case, we have MISO, but there's others that are responsible for the grid. It's kind of stitched together nationally and kind of not. Mm-hmm. Moreover, one of the other issues about the grid is that onboarding lots of renewables requires the grid to be more flexible and responsive. And I think you use the word wise, not smart, which I like. Wise, but you can't take it all down for 2 hours, repair it and get it back up and have it function like it needs to function. And that seems like that's just an enormous challenge about modernizing our grid. How do you do it on the fly? One of the folks you talked to in your book kind of likens it to sort of fixing a whole world. The planes are in the air and all the passengers are in the in the plane seats.
Mm-hmm.
How do you do it?
How do you do it? I mean, it seems to be how it's being done, because it is happening, is that there are interventions at the local level, and then everybody runs behind that to try to figure out how to make it work. The anthropologists included, right? But also the utilities. I talked to a lot of utilities that worked on this book, and they also felt like they were behind. The systems operators also felt like they're behind the developments that are happening, especially in the beginning with large wind farms. And then once everybody sort of felt like they had a handle on how to deal with the variability of wind and the balancing of wind, which was the giant problem in the 2010s. It's not a giant problem anymore, right? Then suddenly you get all of this distributed solar power coming, and then that's a whole new set of issues. And again, like, it's legislative issues and technical issues to make that work. But every time I talk to people in the renewables business, I have one of these amazing conversations where they say, here's this problem that we always knew was there, like what happens when you have a solar neighborhood, right? And now we've run a bunch of tests on it. We have a bunch of solar neighborhoods. We've figured out how to deal with the software problems at this scale. We know the kinds of changes that need to happen, and we feel pretty good about how stable it is, right? And then there's some other new problem, like, okay, what do you do when you have a bunch of electric cars coming on, or when that's an urban neighborhood instead of a rural neighborhood, or when it's the end of the line instead of the middle of a community, all of these things. And then there's a whole nother set of tests that get done to try to figure out how that works. So I feel a little bit, and this is something very specific, I think, to the US, like the innovations on the ground are leading the understandings of how to make those innovations interoperable. And then with each innovation, there is a huge learning curve, and then we know how to do it. So I have a lot of hopefulness, actually, about the energy transition. And I feel like, when I say energy transition, I really mean getting to 80 or 100% renewables all the time, right, on an electricity grid. I feel like this is something we're going to be able to do because we're doing it, right? But we're not doing it by stopping everything, looking at the system, being judicious about it, making a super good plan, taking it all down, building it all back up again. And people do have these moments where they're sort of envious of places where there isn't a strong functional grid, because in those places, like you have urban areas in Bangladesh, for example, that have completely sort of fascinating, many steps ahead of where things are in the US, systems for sharing or balancing solar power, but they have those systems because there was no grid there to begin with. So like we can learn from those, but we can't do it because we do have universal electricity. We do value the fact that we have universal electricity. And it's not just that it's always there and that it's affordable, but that it's a very consistent quality. And this is what you need for your machines to work. You can't have crappy electricity, or you get brownouts, or and you damage the machines, and that's what the power is there for.
You know, the fourth National Climate Assessment Report came out in 2019. That's an intergovernmental agencies of the United States, the DOE, NOAA, others like that. And they have a whole list of things they're looking at that are contributing to climate change and what the situation is and what needs to be done about it. It's, to some extent, it's kind of, it follows on the IPCC's global report, which talks about global warming, and those climate impacts are coming fast and furious. Everybody thinks we need to, at least in both of those publications, thinks we need to be cutting our emissions by about half by about 2030 and getting to 100% zero carbon by 2050. One of the points that the national assessment makes regarding the grid is it needs to be more flexible, more resilient. It needs to be able to stand up to more extreme weather events. So there's that piece of that. And there's another piece, though, that a lot of folks suggest that we need a better national grid in the sense of building large wind and solar in those places where those resources are greatest. In other words, out west. So your conclusion, though, in your book is, yeah, maybe we do need those sort of large centralized solar and wind farms for a period of time, but really that we could get by without having necessarily a heart, as you call it, I think, of the system, but 1,000,000 hearts or 100,000,000 hearts of more distributed generation, it seems like. So I guess speak a little bit about that world, because I don't quite know what to think, because it seems to me we're getting a little bit of mixed messages from the experts about whether or not we need to have a stronger national grid or whether we really need to build out more of a distributed grid.
Yeah, I think it's because both are kind of true.
Okay.
Right. The book was finished, interestingly, before climate change was actually a discussion related to this particular transition. So it was on people's minds, but it was not what was driving things. Renewables were cheaper, they were more exciting, they allowed people to have some sort of control, they allowed people to make some kind of money, and they kind of, it felt like it was this moment at which a revolution in how we made power was in fact necessary. We didn't need to have these giant power plants anymore. So one of the things that happened in 2017 is that suddenly global warming, for whatever reason, came home. I think people felt it. I think there were a couple of really noticeable storms, and suddenly we were talking about an energy transition to renewables that we needed to do because of carbon emissions. What was curious to me about that is that we were already, 15 steps into that transition before that set of considerations. That's not the case in Germany. Germany, it was always about global warming. But in the US, it was about just a new and better way to make money and make power, the two, right, together. And to allow, young people are excited about it. And so young people started to flood into the industry after many generations where you weren't getting, young people were going into computing, young engineers were going into computing instead of going into the energy sector. So there was a lot happening before the conversation shifted in the US. And since the conversation has shifted, which it has, I think what you get is all sectors which have a lot of emissions are a little bit jealous of the electricity sector because such progress has been made. Like, even if you look at Michigan, what is it, 8 to 10% renewable electricity, right? That's still more than you have in any other fossil fuel dependent industry, right? That's just more than what you have with the cars. It's more than what you have with the chemical industry, with manufacturing, right? Like, there's already a lot of changes have begun to happen, and in places like Iowa, where you've got 50% to 80%, it's it's a huge transition that's we're already many steps into it. That said, the two pieces of the grid seem to be developing in very different ways, which is to say the West, and in that I include the Midwest, which is where there are vast spaces between population centers, and there are immense renewables, but different renewable options available. So you have huge amounts of wind in some areas, huge amount of solar in some areas. It looks like some sort of regional balancing of renewables, which requires transmission, will be the easiest answer. It might not be possible to build that transmission because people are against transmission. They will come out on the streets because of it. But there is really a possibility to balance wind in the Dakotas with Utah solar, right? You can do this kind of work. In the East Coast, which is much denser, the move toward microgrids, which are interoperable with each other so that they function very much like a large grid, but in this kind of foam-like mini structures, kind of like a foam stuck together, right, seems to be where things are more going. So in both cases, you're going to have much smaller systems that need to be interoperable with each other, and a transmission system that balances that, right? But the intensity of the necessity for large-scale transmission in the West is different than an intensity of small systems that have to be interoperable with each other in the east. And then the Southwest, you know, I mean, the Southeast is such an interesting area because they have very few resources. They have no hydro resources. They have some solar. It's very flat. It's very moist. There's a lot of sunshine, but there's also really big storms. And I feel like this is the area when we start to get the Southeast starts to figure out how it's going to be renewably powered, the rest of the nation is going to be, we're just going to be running, right? Because everywhere else has some kind of resource. Like you're saying in Michigan, you obviously have the wind that's available nearby, also some in Michigan too, but you have the solar resources, right? Places like Vermont, which should have, you know, no solar power, have massive amounts of solar power, and Green Mountain Power is figuring out how to integrate that. They're doing distributed storage. It's again, like, it's very exciting. And then you look to Alabama and you're like, okay, what is the solution in this place, right? Like, how do you have renewable electricity and also at the smallest scale in the Southeast? That's where I would go if I was still doing this project. That's where I would be in South Carolina. And again, because the rural cooperatives tend to be very forward-looking and have really interesting ideas. They don't always make the best decisions because they have the least amount of money, but they have really, really good people on board.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm going to pause for a second. Michael, please encourage people, if they have questions, to put them into the chat box. Do we need to show that slide, how people can use a chat box? I think folks have it pretty.
Yeah, sure. So if anybody, as we're having the discussion here, if anybody has any questions, you know, please put them in the chat box here. And you know, it looks like you know, some of you indicated there was a few technical difficulties early on, but I think everybody's online now, it seems. So if you do have any questions, please put them into the Q&A chat box, and I can read those off as needed.
So Gretchen, you mentioned I know you're working and living in Germany now. Do you care to do any kind of compare and contrast with a little bit more about what you're seeing either in Europe or other places and what you're seeing kind of in the United States? I think we tend to think of, well, those of us in the industry tend to think of that getting this to happen, getting the utilities to change their business model to some extent, getting people to recognize that there's been a real serious disinvestment in our transmission and distribution systems for a lot of years. I mean, we have parts in the Upper Peninsula that have 100-year-old distribution lines. We have parts of Detroit, Michigan that have 100-year-old distribution lines. So we need to modernize our grid. I think we tend to think, you know, in the United States that it's you know, it's always kind of, you know, one step forward, two steps back, or two steps forward, one step back in terms of how much progress we're in fact making. Michigan has now a 15% goal for its renewable portfolio standard. That said, a number of the utilities are committing to even greater percentages of renewables brought online, which is encouraging. But nonetheless, I think sometimes it feels like we're only getting there with just an awful lot of effort. And one of the points you make in your book that I think is an important one is, you know, how much of this is going to be kind of driven by the business community, the innovators, the entrepreneurs, and how much of this is going to require a stick from some form of government to require policy changes that allow more of this to happen easily.
Yeah. I think it was Winston Churchill that said that you can always trust Americans to do the right thing after they've tried everything else. So I feel like the situation in the U.S. is a lot more dynamic than it is in Europe, and that is a kind of like I think I put this in the book, but that there's a boom and bust cycle to new ideas in the U.S. that's very quick. So if somebody thinks they can make a better, you know, turbine blade, they're going to try it and they're going to put it up and it's going to fall down, right? But they'll get a lot of funding in the meantime. And that's a different mode of sort of innovation and acceptance than what you have in Europe. I don't necessarily think it's worse, but but it's definitely has a very unstable or unsteady feel to it. Like you don't really know where you're going or how fast you're getting there, or even if you're moving forward. The European case is less fun, I would say, from a researcher's point of view. It's much more policy driven. There is a strong belief that you need to have a plan, at least in Germany. You need to have a sound plan, and you need to get the right people at the table to make that sound plan, and you need to pass it into law, and then you need to make it happen. And an interesting, I mean, I should say Germany has an impressive amount of solar power, and they have an impressive amount of wind power, and they're phasing out all of their nuclear in the next 2 to 3 years. So doing that while trying to bring renewables online has basically meant that the carbon emissions in Germany are not going down because the renewables are replacing the nuclear at present. One thing is they have a total coal phase out by 2038, and that means they won't be producing coal anymore, and they won't be using coal to make electricity anymore or to do the manufacturing. And it seems to be widely agreed upon that they'll be one of the last ones to actually get rid of coal, because the plan is so staid and well organized, and there's no way that you can move it, right? So we're moving in a very regulated kind way. There's a lot of care being taken with coal mining communities, with education, with figuring out how to develop the areas which have been really dependent on coal, which are historically rural areas which are quite wealthy, right? So it's not this sense of these are the poorest of the poor, but in fact that mining coal was a reasonably good thing for people, for families, and also for regions, right? So there's all of this good stuff that comes with it, but it's so plodding that in fact places where you're simply doing something less kind, like putting a price tag on coal and then saying actually it doesn't make sense to use coal anymore because it's way more expensive to produce electricity with coal than it is with solar power. Let's just stop buying it and shut those plants down. It seems like that might go faster. So it'll be interesting to see when the total phase out of coal in the US is without a plan versus when it is in Germany with a plan. That said, you're absolutely right that there are energy infrastructure is expensive. And if you want to change the infrastructure in a big way that you're using to produce and distribute power, then you need some government intervention that makes it possible for people to make those investments. That was true in the 1910s, that was true in the 1900s, that was true in the 1880s. Like, there has to be support at the level of policy in order to make a thoroughgoing transition happen, which is equitable, right? Because that's a giant piece of it. It's not just about making cash. It's not just about making power differently. It's about creating an equitable electricity sort of, I don't know what you would call it, like milieu or something, a world in which we can all participate in using this resource to do all our digital stuff, you know?
Right.
So I know you wanted me to say something about conservation, and I think that is a giant piece of the story as well, that things are just designed in Germany. The price of electricity is very, very high, and so things are designed to use less of it, and people are very careful about how much electricity they use. I lived in Quebec before. I was in Quebec for 15 years before I moved to Germany, and there the electricity is essentially free. It's all hydro.
Hydro,
and
right.
People use immense amounts of it, right? And there's just in terms of like understanding what kind, or inventing the technologies that allow you to use significantly less electricity, that kind of innovation isn't happening in Quebec or in Iceland, which also has abundant cheap energy. That kind of innovation is happening in places where the electricity is expensive. And that's very hard for Americans to hear because we like cheap electricity.
Well, one of the pieces you make, one of the cases you make in your book, which is you do a wonderful job looking at Tesla, Nikola Tesla and Edison, and that kind of competition between those two. But then you bring everything kind of full circle at the end of the book, because Tesla was really thinking about the value of electricity in the realm of communication, that it was a way to communicate. And that was sort of what his kind of primary thinking was around that. And of course, what we've now come to realize, I think, today is that the electricity system we have is kind of dumb. It doesn't communicate well. And one of the things we need to do now is instill in our electricity systems the Internet of Things, sort of bidirectional communications, these platforms that you've talked about. And by doing that, then we will use less energy because we'll have demand response, time of day. My cell phone here, I can turn my thermostat down in my house. I can also check the progress of our community solar park to see how many green electrons we're producing. This is, these are 2 apps on a phone. It's pretty amazing stuff, really.
Is still man in loop, right? And what you really want with something as fast as electricity is to get the machines just to talk to each other.
I don't want to have to think about it. Don't make me think.
Exactly. So if you have, for example, a wind, if you're principally using wind power in your home, for example, your dishwasher should simply be able to say, like, oh my gosh, the wind just started blowing really hard. I'm gonna now turn on and I'll wash the dishes, right? And you can put a manual override in there that says, please have the dishes done by 7 a.m., dishwasher friend, right? But that kind of conversation between machines and variable modes of producing electricity absolutely has to happen. Absolutely. And ideally at the level where you spend, I don't know, 4 minutes programming your device when you get it, and then you let it communicate with the grid in such a way that it gets you the lowest price. And that, by that means, your hot water heater is a great example, becomes a resource to the grid, right? So it heats up when there's cheap, abundant power, regardless of how that power is made. And then it just stores thermally. It's actually storing electricity, and then you don't need to heat it up later. Absolutely.
There's some co-ops, at least a couple of co-ops I know in the United States that are, I think they've just simply installed power walls, battery storage in people's homes, with the idea that they have an agreement with those folks that if they have an event coming up where they think they may have an issue of a blackout or issues around peak where the energy prices are going to be very expensive, you're going to have to turn on dirty peaker plants. They have an agreement with those individuals that they can access and dispatch some of that battery storage in their home to deal with the kind of the temporary shortfall. And that just makes all the sense in the world to me.
I know. It makes all the sense in the world. And the idea that storage is, I mean, people love batteries. I'm not sure why. I'm actually really interested in this. People really love batteries. They really love them. But there's a lot of ways to store energy, and thermal, and batteries are chemical storage, right? But thermal storage is also a really good way, either in production of ice or the production of heat. And you can also do that at the smallest of scales with available, and again, like the more variable generation you have, the more of these small and large scale modes of storing energy when it's being made need to be there. And the big thing that people are talking about in Europe right now, I don't know if there's a conversation about this in the US, is power to X. So you essentially, when you're overproducing, right, and this was a big thing in the book, but we haven't said it yet, which is that renewables have a tendency to actually produce more electricity than we can use. Right. So there is this sort of problem of abundance, which is not a 20th century problem. It's not a fossil fuel problem, right? It's a new kind of problem that we have to deal with. Right. So how do you deal with the abundance of sun at noon when everybody has solar? How do you deal with the abundance of the wind just before dawn when no one is using electricity, but boy, is it blowing, right? So there's this power to X, which can be power to heat, but is often power to gas. is a question is if you can use wind turbines, in fact, to make hydrogen. And from that, you can make biomethane, for example, and then you can continue to use the natural gas networks that are in place, but with green, not what it's called now, fossil gas, not with fossil gas, but with green gas, which functions, it's molecularly identical, right? So that's another example of storage. The question of like, okay, can we store wind energy, kinetic energy in gas?
So I mean, our good friend Bill Gates has that carbon engineering project where they're doing carbon capture and sequestration, pulling carbon just literally out of the air, and then they're splitting atoms and doing this and that and creating hydrogen fuel.
Right, exactly. And ammonia. I mean, ammonia is great. You can use it to grow stuff. And it's liquid. You can throw it on a tanker and you can truck it around the world, right? And if you have an accident on your ammonia tanker, it's not great for the natural environment, but it's not nearly as bad as an accident on an oil tanker. So I think there are, if you're talking about the larger energy transition, not just electricity systems, but the sort of the total phase out of fossil fuels, there are these sort of moments where you can sort of see the question mark of like, can we use the infrastructure we have to do this thing? Or do we really need an entirely new infrastructure in order to do it? And again, with electricity, I feel like this has been worked out in the trenches for the last 20 years. These questions of how we can keep a lot of the infrastructure that we have and add to it, sort of answers your earlier question, and add a whole bunch of new kind of ways of making or thinking about or balancing electrical generation that's new, and creating communities, right? Your solar park is a good example of that, like how you create a community through a very differently sited, different produced, differently funded mode of electricity production.
Right. So I have a couple of questions, if you don't mind me interjecting real quick.
Okay, Michael, we're getting down to the last few minutes, so fire away though.
All right, so there's a little bit of a comment in this here as well, but I'm just going to read the whole piece because I think it makes sense. So what are your thoughts about fuel switching and beneficial electrification in terms of impact on the grid? With the context of it's interesting to see environmental groups fighting new transmission in the US while also pushing for electrification end uses such as heat pumps and electric vehicles.
So this is why I wrote the book, because I felt like there were all of the people that were like, we just want it all to be green right now, and then sort of made a bunch of bad guys out of everybody that was maintaining the system, right? And the system, the grid, it's very, very hard to change. So I think there has to be a kind of sympathy in some ways for the work that it takes to maintain the infrastructure in its current state, while nevertheless demanding that certain processes be done faster. And I think the siting of transmission is probably a big piece of that. And also understanding community level resistance to things. So much of what we have seen with the transformation of the grid is an intense desire for communities to be taken into consideration when we're talking about energy issues. They don't want a giant transmission line that runs through the back of the county if none of that electricity is made there or stays there, right? And so how do you put these things together? The needs to convert to a green system, which has certain infrastructural things which are very easy, community level desires, which have cultural things, which should in fact be built into the system because that's how we've always done it, right? And even assuming that everyone has goodwill, this is very difficult to do, and not everyone has goodwill.
Great. So another question out here. Brings up individual Gail Tevberg and voice in the kind of peak oil front, kind of talks about dismissing alternative energy as too intermittent to be effective, and that the grid really demands stable supply. How can this, how would you respond to a question like that, or how can this be overcome?
The idea, the 20th century idea for the way the electricity system would work was called command and control, which meant that you had somebody who decided how much power would be made and made an order for a bunch of coal, and that coal came and somebody else decided how much it would burn, and that was then sent to the consumer. That is just no longer the way things are. It's already no longer the way things are. So not only does baseload, which is what that's talking about, we talked a little bit about how you can use smarter technologies in order to make up for what you would say is electricity all the time, as much as we want, whenever we want it for a price we can afford, right? That is the way that the utilities always worked. But there are other ways to balance, and there are other ways to store. Essentially, if you turn on your porch light and you're somewhere where you're using coal, the storage for that light is a giant pile of coal outside the doors of that electricity factory, right? If you're using solar power and it's nighttime because you're turning your light on, where is that storage, right? Is that storage a bunch of thermal? Is that storage a battery pack? Is that storage, I don't know, what would be the other way to do it? I guess those would be the two that we have right now, right? But you want the light to come on, right? You want the light to come on. Maybe what you have, in fact, is instead of increasing generation in one place, you're balancing with wind, which is coming, you know, which as the sun goes down begins to blow harder. So there's to think in terms of balance and storage as opposed to command and control. This is the way that you can actually run an electricity system reasonably well, and I think very well as we continue forward with what we're learning on 100% renewables. Also, hydro helps a lot.
Yeah, I think it was Mary Powell actually of the Green Mountain Power in Vermont, who I think I heard her say at one point, well, you know, the sun is always shining and the wind is always blowing somewhere. So if the grid is connected, if the grid is connected in such a way that it'll take care of that intermittent issue. But I think the other real component of that piece is going to be storage. Yeah. You know, there are utilities that are bringing on whole plants that are just battery plants. They're just basically storing up that power and dispatching it and doing it that way. So, and
also the ability to turn down things on command, right? So that it's not just that you produce more power on command, but that you can actually reduce consumption on command. And I want to say one last thing before we're done, which is that the refrigerator was designed to use electricity 24 hours a day because the utilities needed somebody to, they wanted to burn coal all night because it was easier for them to do that. And there was nobody was using any electricity at night. People went home, they turned all their stuff off and went to bed. And even today, if you look at your refrigerator, if there was a way to run that thing at night to keep the food cold, you actually wouldn't need electricity really in your house between when you go to bed and when you wake up in the morning. So I think it's also important to understand that there is a history to the kind of dependence, the 24-hour dependence that we have on power that then makes us look at coal burning power plants or natural gas power plants, anything command and control, also hydro, right, as being necessary. But it's not necessary. It's part of the history of capitalism in America. And we can change those machines. That's not the hardest thing. Changing government might be harder. But the machines we can certainly change.
So Gretchen, you tell me, you said you kind of turned away from necessarily focusing this topic as your academic exercise you're doing these days. So what are you working on now? What are you teaching? What are you researching? What are you writing about? I'd be curious to hear that.
I'm working on the phase out of fossil fuels. So I feel like I feel like the electricity part of it, I'm really happy with, like in a way, like I wrote the book and then I feel like all of you are taking all of this for you, like you're just doing it and it's happening, right? And there will be bumps, but it's happening differently in different places. But off we will go, you know. They have solar panels in Scotland where it like rains all the time. It's crazy. It's everywhere.
Right.
Needs to be more, but it's coming. But there are other really significant issues related to fossil fuels. So you were talking about information, electricity and information being linked, but fossil fuels and transportation are really linked. And it's not just about the cars, it's also about the trucks, the ships, it's how we get our bananas, you know, that's all, that entire global sort of circulation of stuff is all fossil fueled. There's a lot of questions about that. And then of course, home heating is the other one. So most people have gas or oil heating, except in places where some decision was made long ago to use electricity, which is not, you don't get warm enough. I have to say, I'm not a great fan of the electric heater, but the figuring out how, especially when you have an individualized system, fossil fuel system for heating, how to transition that into anything else is quite complicated. So I'm looking at those two principally, and then of course, high carbon materials like steel and cement. You try to imagine a world without cement, your brain just explodes right away.
Yeah, pretty much. And this will be taking the form of another book, you think, or some articles, or both?
So I'm doing the research now, but I feel like there is such a tendency when we talk about carbon dioxide emissions to just sort of say, I guess we can't do it. Like, it's everything, and so probably we'll just fail. There's this kind of apocalyptic like default setting. And so there is really a part of me that wants to show the places or the instances or the logics or the attempts to make that not the case, right?
Yeah. Good.
So
I'm looking
I
forward
don't
to
have
it.
all of it's a little like the grid. I feel like when I started researching the grid, there wasn't that much going on with renewables, and the transition sort of rose to meet me in the process of doing the research. And I just hope that this will also be the case with the current book. Otherwise, when I'm done with it in 10 years, we'll all have actually given up hope. But yeah, I'm sort of hoping it.
Yeah, let's hold on for hope at least. So again, thank you so much for your time today. Everybody, I want to encourage you to take a look at Gretchen's book. It really is a fine piece of work. Also, this interview will be on YouTube at some point, as well as our website. So thank you for that. Michael, any other last minute things I should be mentioning to everybody?
Nope, I think we're okay. So thank you again for your time.
So Gretchen, are you going to stay in Germany, you think then? Are you kind of have left North America for a spell?
I feel like I wanted to be someplace where concern about global warming was an everyday piece of the conversation. And what I expected when I got here, which that is true, and there's research in Berlin, and Berlin is like has more institutes researching global warming than you can possibly imagine from in every which way. But I feel like in doing the research for the book, as I really begin to get serious about it, there's a number of case studies that will actually happen in the US, because even though it is kind of cattywampus, which is to say not like linear,
sure.
In the States, some of the most interesting developments actually are happening there. So my guess is I'll split my time on both sides of the pond. In some ways, we're the most vulnerable. We're the most fossil fuel dependent people in the world. And so both the US and the European story is how to try to maintain the world we have, make it better, even smarter and kinder, but at the same level that fossil fuels have made possible without fossil fuels.
Yeah.
So
that is the rub.
We have a common problem.
Yeah, that is the rub. We'll look forward to it. Again, thank you, everybody. Happy Thursday. See you later.
Thank you. I didn't see all you, but I know you're there.
Thanks again. See ya.
Goodbye.